The air in the courtroom hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of anticipation and hushed whispers. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy windows, cast long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Jalen Carter, all of 12 years old, but looking smaller, thinner, swallowed by the oversized suit he wore, perched on the edge of the witness stand. He felt the weight of 100 gazes, 100 silent judgments, pressing down on him. His small hands, clenched tight in his lap, were slick with sweat. Just tell the truth, he told himself, his mother's words a fragile shield against the rising tide of fear. Just tell the truth, Jalen. The defense attorney, Mr. Caldwell, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, paced before him like a predator circling its prey. His voice, smooth and polished as river stones, echoed through the silent room. Jalen, he began, the name dripping with false concern. Can you tell the jury, in your own words, what happened on the night of July 17th? Jalen swallowed, his throat dry as dust. The memory, a raw and festering wound, pulsed in his mind. The flashing lights, the harsh grip on his arms, the pavement scraping against his cheek. He looked towards his mother, a small woman with a spine of steel, seated in the front row. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, met his. A silent promise passed between them, a shared strength in the face of this ordeal. For Mom, he thought. I have to do this for Mom. The cops say they beat me, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The microphone amplified his words, making them sound brittle and fragile in the vastness of the courtroom. He could feel Caldwell's gaze, sharp and dissecting, boring into him. He fought the urge to shrink back, to disappear into the worn fabric of the chair. Caldwell's smile widened, a fraction too sharp, a fraction too knowing. Beat you, Jalen? Isn't it possible that you resisted arrest? That you provoked the officers? Each word was a carefully placed barb, designed to snag and tear at the fragile fabric of his testimony. Jalen's breath hitched. Provoked? He'd been walking home from the library, a worn copy of The Hobbit tucked under his arm. Provoked? He'd been 12 years old. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the insidious suggestion. Don't let him trick you, a voice whispered in his head, the voice of his older brother, gone now, but still a source of strength. No, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of steel. I didn't do anything. I told them I couldn't breathe. They just kept going. The silence that followed his words was absolute, broken only by the quiet click of the court reporter's keyboard. The faces in the jury box were a study in conflicting emotions: shock, disbelief, a flicker of dawning horror. Even Caldwell seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw power of Jalen's simple statement. Jalen's mother, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared straight ahead, her face a mask of controlled fury. He knew she was reliving every moment of that night, the frantic search, the agonizing wait at the hospital, the sight of her son, bruised and broken. Caldwell, recovering his composure, launched into a series of pointed questions, each one designed to cast doubt on Jalen's account. He questioned his memory, his perception, even his character. He painted a picture of a troubled boy, prone to exaggeration, seeking attention. Jalen's internal monologue became a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, a desperate need to be believed. He felt like a butterfly pinned under glass, dissected and examined under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The prosecuting attorney, Mr. Davis, a man with kind eyes and a quiet strength, objected several times, his voice a steady counterpoint to Caldwell's calculated attacks. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been sown. Jalen could feel the jury's uncertainty, the subtle shift in their gazes. Then, just as the defense seemed to be gaining the upper hand, Mr. Davis played his trump card. Your Honor, he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, I would like to introduce into evidence a newly discovered piece of video footage. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade cracked, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The video, grainy and shaky, but undeniably clear, showed the entire incident. It showed two uniformed officers, Daniels and Hughes, pinning a small boy to the ground, their blows raining down on him. It showed Jalen's desperate struggles, his pleas for mercy. It showed the officers' indifference, their callous disregard for his pain. The silence that followed the video was deafening. The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle with a palpable tension. Officer Hughes, his face ashen, avoided eye contact with anyone. Officer Daniels, however, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, a defiant glint in his eyes. In that moment, the tide turned. The jury's expressions shifted from doubt to certainty, from skepticism to outrage. Jalen, watching from the witness stand, felt a wave of relief wash over him, so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had been believed. Finally, he had been believed. The truth, buried under layers of doubt and deception, had finally been brought to light. Later, after the jury delivered their guilty verdicts, Jalen sat beside his mother on the courthouse steps. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the day's events. He leaned against his mother, feeling the warmth of her arm around his shoulders. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The shared silence was a testament to their resilience, their shared victory. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served. And in the quiet of the evening, a small, bruised boy could finally begin to heal. The courtroom air hung thick and heavy, suffocating in its silence. The echo of Jalen's small voice still seemed to vibrate in the dust motes dancing in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the tall windows. He sat hunched, a small island in the expansive witness chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The wood felt rough beneath his fingers, a grounding sensation against the swirling chaos inside. He'd spoken, recounted the nightmare that had clawed its way into his life, staining it with fear and pain. Now the silence pressed down, a tangible weight. He could feel his mother's gaze, a warm cloak in the frigid room, a silent promise of support. Her hand, resting on his shoulder, trembled almost imperceptibly. "It's okay." Her touch seemed to say, "You've done enough." But had he? A sliver of doubt, sharp and cold, pierced through the numbness. The defense attorney, Mr. Caldwell, a man whose tailored suit and polished shoes screamed of expensive indifference, rose with a practiced smoothness. He adjusted his tie, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Jalen watched him, a small knot tightening in his stomach. The lawyer's smile didn't quite reach those eyes, a disconnect that sent a shiver down Jalen's spine. He'd seen that same look on Officer Daniels' face, right before Jalen squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, pushing the memory back into the dark recesses of his mind. "Don't think about it now," he told himself. "Just breathe." "Now, Jalen," Caldwell's voice was smooth, like oiled silk. "You testified that you clearly saw the officers' faces. But you also stated it was nighttime, a dark street. Isn't that right?" Jalen swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's attention on him, heavy and suffocating. Caldwell was trying to trap him, to twist his words. He'd practiced this, going over the questions with the prosecutor, Ms. Diaz, but the reality was different, colder. "He wants you to be wrong," a voice whispered in his head. "He wants everyone to think you're lying." "Yes, sir," Jalen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell pounced. "So, given the darkness, how can you be certain of your identification? Isn't it possible you might be mistaken?" Jalen's knuckles turned white as he gripped the chair. He knew what Caldwell was doing. He was planting seeds of doubt, blurring the lines, making the truth seem hazy, uncertain. He could see it in the faces of the jury, a flicker of uncertainty, a ripple of doubt. He had to fight back. He had to make them see. He took a deep breath, the air catching in his lungs. He looked directly at Caldwell, his gaze unwavering. "It wasn't dark. We were right under a streetlight." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Jalen felt a surge of something akin to triumph, a small victory in the face of overwhelming odds. Caldwell's smile faltered, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. He'd expected hesitation, uncertainty. He hadn't expected Jalen's quiet certainty, the unwavering strength in his small frame. He recovered quickly, though, his professional mask snapping back into place. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch another volley of carefully crafted questions designed to chip away at Jalen's credibility. But he was interrupted. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Thompson's voice was firm, laced with a hint of impatience. "I believe the witness has answered your question. Let's move forward." Caldwell bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the judge's admonition. He glanced at Jalen, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, before turning his attention to his notes. He knew he'd been thwarted, at least for the moment. He'd underestimated the boy, the quiet resilience that simmered beneath the surface. He needed a new strategy, a different angle of attack. Jalen's mother squeezed his shoulder, a silent message of reassurance. He leaned into her touch, drawing strength from her presence. The judge's intervention had given him a reprieve, a moment to collect himself, to prepare for the next onslaught. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ms. Diaz, the prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, rose to her feet. She held a small flash drive in her hand, her expression unreadable. Jalen watched her, a spark of hope flickering in his chest. He told her about the security camera across the street from where the beating had taken place. He'd clung to that memory, the small, flickering light in the darkness, a silent witness to the injustice he'd suffered. "Your Honor," Ms. Diaz addressed the judge, her voice clear and resonant, "I'd like to introduce a new piece of evidence." The defense attorney immediately objected, his voice rising in protest. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This evidence should have been disclosed during discovery." Ms. Diaz remained calm, her gaze steady. "Your Honor, this evidence was only recently recovered. I believe it will shed significant light on the events in question." A hushed tension filled the courtroom. Jalen felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it was on that flash drive. He'd seen the flickering red light of the camera that night, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Judge Thompson considered for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I will allow it," she finally ruled. "But I expect a full explanation from the prosecution as to why this evidence was not presented earlier." Ms. Diaz nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. She turned to the bailiff and handed him the flash drive. The bailiff inserted it into the courtroom computer, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy black and white image. The courtroom held its breath. The image on the screen sharpened, focusing on the street corner where the incident had taken place. The street light cast long, distorted shadows, but the figures beneath it were unmistakable. Two police officers, Daniels and Hughes, stood over a small, huddled figure. Jalen. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The video played, grainy and silent, but the brutality was undeniable. Daniel's fist connected with Jalen's stomach, sending him sprawling to the ground. Hughes then stepped forward, delivering a kick to Jalen's ribs. Jalen watched the scene unfold, a wave of nausea washing over him. It was like reliving the nightmare all over again, but this time everyone could see it. Everyone could see the truth. Officer Hughes' face, pale and drawn, was visible on the screen. He'd looked away, a flicker of guilt, of shame, crossing his features. That flicker of guilt was now magnified, projected onto the large screen for everyone to see. The defense attorney sat frozen, his carefully constructed arguments crumbling around him like a house of cards. He tried to paint Jalen as unreliable, a child whose memory couldn't be trusted. But the video spoke for itself. The truth, stark and brutal, was there for all to see. The video ended, the final image lingering on the screen. Jalen lying crumpled on the pavement, small and broken. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then a single sob broke the stillness. It came from the back of the room, a choked, ragged sound. It was Officer Hughes. He was crying. He was confessing. The truth had finally broken through. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a dull, insistent drone that mirrored the thrumming anxiety in Jalen's chest. His small hands, dwarfed by the oversized blazer he wore, gripped the edges of the witness stand. He could feel the weight of 100 gazes, 100 silent judgments pressing down on him. The defense attorney's voice, smooth as polished granite, echoed in the cavernous room, each question a carefully crafted barb designed to chip away at his composure. "So, Jalen," the man began, his tone dripping with feigned concern, "are you absolutely certain about the sequence of events? A 12-year-old's memory can be unreliable, wouldn't you agree?" Jalen's throat tightened. He swallowed. The click of his dry throat amplified in the sudden hush. Unreliable. The word hung in the air, a venomous whisper. He thought of his mother, her face pale but resolute in the front row. Her unwavering belief in him was the anchor tethering him to this reality, this ordeal. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to meet the lawyer's shrewd gaze. "Yes, sir," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember." The prosecuting attorney, a man with tired eyes and a set jaw, stepped forward. "Jalen, can you take us back to that night? Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened?" The lawyer's voice, though gentle, held a firmness, a steadiness that Jalen found oddly comforting. He closed his eyes, the courtroom dissolving around him, replaced by the chill of that autumn evening. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves and something else, something metallic and acrid that he wouldn't understand until later. He had been walking home from Michael's house, their laughter still echoing in the crisp night air. They'd spent the afternoon building a fort in Michael's backyard, their hands rough and stained with dirt, their imaginations weaving tales of dragons and knights. A childish escape, a world away from the reality that was about to crash down on him. Just a normal night, until it wasn't. He opened his eyes, the courtroom shimmering back into focus. "I was walking home," he began, his voice thin and reedy. It was getting dark. He described the flashing lights of the patrol car, the sudden heart-stopping fear that gripped him as the two officers approached. He'd been humming a tuneless melody, lost in his own thoughts, oblivious to their presence until they were practically upon him. Officer Daniels, a tall, imposing figure with a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face, had demanded to know where he was going, his voice laced with suspicion. Jalen had stammered, his heart pounding against his ribs, explaining that he was walking home from a friend's house. He'd shown them the crumpled note from his mother, permission to stay late. "I did everything right." The memory of the paper, now a shredded exhibit in a plastic bag, twisted something inside him. He'd been polite, respectful, even a little scared. He'd done nothing wrong. The defense attorney interjected, his voice sharp, accusatory. "Isn't it true, Jalen, that you were acting suspiciously? That you were loitering in a known high-crime area?" Jalen flinched. High-crime area. That's what they called his neighborhood. His home. He looked at his mother, saw the flash of pain in her eyes, the subtle clenching of her jaw. He thought of the vibrant murals painted on the brick walls, the laughter of children playing hopscotch on the cracked sidewalks, the aroma of Mrs. Rodriguez's empanadas wafting from her open kitchen window. "This is our home." He shook his head, the small movement of visible tremor in the silent courtroom. "No, sir," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "I was just walking home." His voice grew stronger as he recounted the escalating tension, the way Officer Daniels' eyes had narrowed, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. He made a comment about Jalen's clothes, his worn sneakers, his faded jeans, a thinly veiled insult about his family, his community. Officer Hughes, younger, with a hesitant, almost apologetic look in his eyes, had tried to intervene, to de-escalate the situation. But Daniels had brushed him off, his words a venomous stream of prejudice and disdain. He enjoyed it. The power. The realization hit Jalen with a chilling certainty. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about control, about asserting dominance. He closed his eyes, the memory a physical blow. He could almost smell the stale cigarette smoke on Daniel's breath, feel the rough grip of his hand on his arm, the sudden, searing pain as he was shoved against the brick wall. Then came the blows. Each strike, a sickening thud, echoed in the hushed courtroom. Jalen's voice trembled, but he didn't falter. He described the systematic brutality, the calculated cruelty of the attack. He remembered the way his vision had blurred, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the raw, burning pain that radiated through his small body. He remembered the fear, the sheer animal terror that had consumed him as he curled into a ball, trying to protect himself from the onslaught. He remembered the way Officer Hughes had turned away, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. He didn't stop it, but he saw, and that, Jalen realized, was the turning point. Hughes' silence, his complicity, was as damning as Daniel's violence. He had witnessed the injustice, the brutality, and he had chosen to do nothing. Until now. The prosecuting attorney approached the bench, his expression grim. "Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence to present." He held up a USB drive. Recovered from a nearby security camera, this footage corroborates Jalen's testimony in its entirety. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and whispers. The defense attorney's face paled, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like dry earth. On the large screen, grainy but undeniable, the scene unfolded. The flashing lights, the confrontation, the brutal attack. It was all there, a silent testament to Jalen's courage, his truth. Officer Hughes, his face ashen, finally broke. His confession, a choked whisper of guilt and remorse, filled the stunned silence of the courtroom. Jalen looked at his mother, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He reached for her hand, his small fingers intertwining with hers. In that moment, the weight of 100 gazes lifted, replaced by a single, unwavering truth. Justice. The air in the courtroom hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from hushed whispers and the scent of old paper. Jalen sat hunched in the witness box, the oversized chair swallowing his small frame. His hands, clasped tightly in his lap, were slick with sweat, the clammy feeling a stark contrast to the icy dread that coiled in his stomach. He tried to focus on the intricate wood grain of the witness stand, a small, insignificant detail in the vast, intimidating room. Anything to avoid the weight of all those eyes boring into him, dissecting him. "They don't believe me," a small, frightened voice whispered in the back of his mind. "They think I'm lying." The defense attorney, Mr. Caldwell, a man whose tailored suit and polished shoes screamed of expensive indifference, paced before the jury box. His voice, smooth as aged whiskey, resonated through the silent courtroom. Officers Daniels and Hughes were responding to a call about an attempted robbery in the vicinity. He announced, his words carefully measured, each syllable dripping with practiced sincerity. Jalen flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, at the mention of the officers' names. He could almost feel the phantom weight of their hands on him, the brutal pressure against his ribs, the sharp sting of pain. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fleeting moment, the image of Daniel's sneering face flashing behind his eyelids. "Liar," the face seemed to hiss. "No one will believe you." Mr. Caldwell's voice droned on, weaving a narrative that felt both familiar and alien. "Mr. Carter," he continued, his tone laced with a subtle condescension that grated on Jalen's nerves, "was acting suspiciously, lurking in the alleyway." Jalen's breath hitched in his throat. Lurking? He'd been waiting for his mother, shielding himself from the biting wind. He'd been humming a tune his grandmother used to sing, a melody that now felt tainted, stained with the memory of fear and violence. He wanted to shout, to interrupt the carefully constructed lies, but his voice caught in his throat, a strangled gasp. He glanced at his mother, a small, fragile figure in the front row. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together in a thin, tight line, but her eyes, fixed on him, held an unwavering strength that somehow managed to seep into his trembling heart. He refused to comply with verbal commands. Caldwell continued, his voice rising slightly, adding a touch of drama to the narrative, and attempted to flee. The word hung in the air, a blatant accusation. Jalen felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Flee? He'd been terrified. He just wanted to go home. He tried to explain, to tell them he hadn't done anything, but his words had been lost, swallowed by the officer's aggression. The defense attorney produced the police report, holding it aloft as if it were some sacred text. He pointed out sections, highlighting phrases, his voice echoing the cold, impersonal language of the document. Resisting arrest obstruction of justice matching the suspect's description. Each phrase felt like a punch to the gut, stealing Jalen's breath. He could feel the jury's gaze shift, their expressions hardening, doubt creeping into their eyes. They're believing him, he thought despairingly. They're seeing me as a criminal, not a victim. Mr. Caldwell painted a picture of a routine police procedure, a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He minimized the injuries, referring to them as minor scrapes and bruises, a dismissive phrase that made Jalen's stomach churn. He knew the truth. He could still feel the throbbing ache in his ribs, the lingering pain in his jaw. Caldwell then expertly shifted the narrative, subtly implying that Jalen's injuries were self-inflicted, the result of his own resistance. He questioned Jalen's memory, suggesting his young age made him unreliable, susceptible to suggestion. "Isn't it possible, Mr. Carter," he asked, his voice dripping with feigned concern, "that in the confusion, the fear of the moment, your recollection of events might be inaccurate?" The word hung in the air, a venomous seed of doubt planted in the minds of the jury. Jalen felt a tremor run through him. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, constricted by a fear so profound it threatened to suffocate him. "They're twisting everything," he thought desperately. "They're making me the villain." He closed his eyes, trying to block out the lawyer's insinuating tone, the skeptical glances of the jury. He wished he could disappear, fade away into the hushed silence of the courtroom. Just when Jalen thought he couldn't bear it any longer, the prosecuting attorney, Mr. Davis, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a fierce determination, rose to his feet. He addressed the judge, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to Caldwell's theatrical performance. "Your Honor," he said, holding up a flash drive, "I'd like to introduce a new piece of evidence." A hush fell over the courtroom, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade seemed to crack, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The courtroom lights dimmed, and a grainy image flickered onto the screen. It was security footage from a nearby store, capturing the alleyway where the incident had occurred. The footage was silent, but the images spoke volumes. It clearly showed Daniels and Hughes cornering Jalen, their aggressive postures undeniable. It showed Jalen's attempts to back away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. And then it showed the brutal beating, the officer's fists connecting with Jalen's small body again and again. The silent footage was more damning than any words could have been. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen's mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Caldwell's face paled, his confident demeanor crumbling. He opened his mouth to object, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The truth, captured in stark, undeniable detail, had silenced him. Even Officer Hughes, who until that moment had maintained a stoic silence, seemed to crumble under the weight of the evidence. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. A choked sob escaped his lips. The confession, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air. The jury's expressions shifted again, this time from skepticism to horror to dawning understanding. And in Jalen's heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. "They believe me," he thought, the words echoing through the silent courtroom, a fragile whisper in the face of overwhelming relief. "They finally believe me." The air in the courtroom crackled, thick with anticipation. Jalen sat hunched in the witness stand, the oversized suit swallowing his small frame. His hands, clasped tightly in his lap, were slick with sweat. "Just tell the truth," he repeated silently, a mantra against the gnawing fear. He could feel his mother's gaze, a silent pillar of strength from the front row. He wouldn't cry. He wouldn't let them see him break. The defense attorney, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, paced before him. His voice, smooth as polished stone, chipped away at Jalen's testimony, twisting his words, painting him as a troubled child prone to exaggeration. Each question felt like a blow, bruising his already battered spirit. "They're trying to make me the liar," Jalen thought, his stomach clenching. "But I know what I saw. I know what they did." The lawyer's words blurred into a monotonous drone, the courtroom lights seeming to dim, constricting his chest. He stole a glance at the two officers, Daniels and Hughes. Daniels stared back, his face a mask of cold indifference. But Hughes, his gaze flickered, darting away as if unable to sustain the weight of Jalen's silent accusation. A flicker of something guilt? Jalen wasn't sure. He just knew he had to hold on. The truth was a fragile thing in this room, easily crushed beneath the weight of power and influence. The prosecuting attorney, a younger man with tired eyes and a determined set to his jaw, rose to his feet. Jalen watched him, a flicker of hope igniting within the suffocating fear. He'd seen that look before, a quiet resolve that hinted at something more. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice resonated with a newfound strength, cutting through the stagnant air like a blade. "We have video." The words hung in the silence that followed, each syllable heavy with implication. Jalen's heart leaped in his chest. Video? He hadn't known a ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, the hushed whispers escalating into a cacophony of gasps and exclamations. The defense attorney's carefully constructed composure crumbled. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the prosecutor to the judge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Jalen's mother's hand flew to her mouth, a muffled sob escaping her lips. He reached out, his small hand covering hers, offering a silent reassurance he wasn't even sure he felt himself. The judge, a stern woman with a face etched with years of witnessing human drama, banged her gavel, restoring a semblance of order to the chaotic scene. The video played on a large screen, grainy but undeniable. It showed the alleyway, dimly lit, the shadows concealing nothing. There, in stark black and white, were the two officers, their faces contorted with rage. The beating unfolded, brutal and swift, each blow a sickening thud that echoed in the silent courtroom. Jalen watched, detached from the scene, yet simultaneously reliving the terror, the pain, the suffocating helplessness. His breath hitched in his throat, his body trembling despite his efforts to remain stoic. He felt his mother's hand tighten around his, her silent strength anchoring him to the present. The courtroom was a tempest of emotions, a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and outrage. The defense attorney's protests were drowned out by the collective gasp that followed a particularly savage blow in the video. Daniel's face, previously impassive, now contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. Hughes, his head in his hands, seemed to shrink in his seat, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The video ended, the silence that followed even more deafening than the chaos that had preceded it. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung heavy in the air. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted, the scales of justice finally tipping in Jalen's favor. The prosecutor, his voice steady and clear, addressed the jury, his words no longer needing to persuade, but merely to reiterate the undeniable truth displayed on the screen. Jalen watched, a strange calm settling over him. The fear hadn't vanished, not entirely, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of vindication. He had told the truth, and finally, it had been heard. The jury's deliberation was swift, their verdict unanimous. Guilty. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, a wave of emotion that washed over Jalen, leaving him feeling strangely empty yet simultaneously full. He looked at his mother, her eyes shining with tears, a small smile gracing her lips. He knew this was just the beginning, the first step on a long road to healing. But for now, in this moment, justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. And somewhere deep inside, the 12-year-old boy who had been so brutally wronged began to breathe again. The courtroom air hung thick and heavy, the silence punctuated by the rhythmic whir of the projector. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, illuminating the stark white screen like tiny, frantic souls. Jalen sat beside his mother, his small hand engulfed in hers, feeling the tremors that ran through her body. He didn't need to look to know the video was playing. He could feel it in the sudden, collective intake of breath that swept through the courtroom, in the way the silence had deepened, become pregnant with something unspeakable. He squeezed his mother's hand, a silent promise, a shared burden. "It's almost over, Mama." He hadn't allowed himself to believe it until this very moment. But now, a fragile seed of hope began to bloom in the desolate landscape of his heart. On the screen, a smaller, more vulnerable version of himself stood framed against the harsh backdrop of a brick alleyway. The grainy footage, time-stamped and stark, played out the scene Jalen had recounted on the stand, a scene etched into his memory with brutal clarity. He saw himself flinch as the first blow landed, heard the muffled thud that echoed sickeningly in the courtroom. His mother's grip tightened, her nails digging into his palm, a silent scream trapped in her throat. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that it was just a recording, a ghost of the past, but the words wouldn't come. The past wasn't a ghost. It lived and breathed within him, a constant, throbbing ache. The defense attorney, Mr. Caldwell, shifted in his seat, his crisp suit rustling like dry leaves. He maintained an air of unflappable confidence throughout the trial, his voice smooth and measured, his words carefully chosen to dissect and dismantle Jalen's testimony. Now, a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, his eyes darting between the screen and the jury. He knows he's losing. The thought was a small, bitter triumph, a flicker of light in the encroaching darkness. The video continued, each frame a fresh wave of nausea washing over Jalen. He saw Officer Daniels' face, contorted in a mask of rage, heard the same words that had haunted his nightmares. "Ain't no cameras here, kid." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jalen's mother's breath hitched, a choked sob escaping her lips. He wanted to close his eyes, to erase the images from his mind, but he forced himself to watch, to bear witness to his own suffering. This was his truth, and he would not look away. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, a man whose quiet determination had been a steady anchor throughout the ordeal, stood and addressed the court. His voice, usually calm and measured, now vibrated with barely contained fury. He confirmed the authenticity of the video, detailing the painstaking process of retrieving the footage from a nearby security camera, a camera the officers hadn't known existed. Caldwell, regaining his composure, launched into a desperate counteroffensive, suggesting the video could have been manipulated, that the boy's injuries were exaggerated. His words felt hollow, brittle, shattering against the undeniable truth displayed on the screen. The jury, their faces grim, remained unmoved. Jalen watched them, searching their eyes for a flicker of understanding, of belief. "They believe me. They have to." The judge, a stern-faced woman with eyes that missed nothing, turned to the officers. "Officer Daniels, Officer Hughes, do you have any comment on this evidence?" Daniels remained stoic, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. Hughes, however, began to tremble. His face, previously pale, flushed a deep crimson. He avoided eye contact, his gaze flitting nervously around the room. Jalen watched him, a strange mixture of pity and anger churning within him. He knew it was wrong. He knew it all along. Hughes opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, swallowing hard. His breathing grew ragged, his shoulders shaking. He looked at Daniels, a silent plea in his eyes, but Daniels remained impassive, a statue carved from granite. The silence stretched, taut, and unbearable. Finally, Hughes broke. His voice, barely a whisper, cracked through the stillness. "I tried to stop him." The words tumbled out, disjointed and fragmented, followed by a torrent of choked sobs. He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with convulsions. The dam had broken, and the truth, long suppressed, began to pour forth. The courtroom was in an uproar. Murmurs swelled into a cacophony of voices. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order. When the noise subsided, she addressed the court, her voice firm and unwavering. "Given the new evidence presented and the confession of Officer Hughes, we will take a recess." She rose from her bench, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Jalen. He couldn't decipher the expression in her eyes, but a strange sense of calm settled over him, a quiet assurance that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. As the courtroom emptied, Jalen's mother pulled him into a tight embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, the scent of her perfume a familiar comfort in the unfamiliar chaos. He felt her tears on his cheek, warm and salty, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry. Not tears of pain or fear, but tears of release, of a burden finally lifted. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of his mother's arms, Jalen knew he had won. The stale air of the courtroom hung heavy, thick with anticipation. The low hum of murmured conversations, abruptly silenced by the bailiff's sharp call to order, echoed the tension tightening in Jalen's chest. He sat beside his mother, her hand a comforting weight on his knee, its warmth seeping through the thin fabric of his trousers. He'd recounted the events of that day so many times, each repetition a fresh peeling back of the scab, the raw wound underneath throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Yet this time, something felt different. A shift in the atmosphere, a palpable sense of expectation. He couldn't quite name it, but it prickled his skin like the ghost of a touch. He glanced at the prosecuting attorney, Mr. Henderson, who offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered within him. Officer Hughes, his face pale and drawn, took the stand. Jalen watched him, his small hands clenched in his lap. Hughes shifted under the weight of the courtroom's gaze, his eyes darting nervously towards Officer Daniels, who sat impassively at the defense table. Daniels' unwavering stare, cold and hard, sent a shiver down Jalen's spine. He'd seen that look before on the day everything changed. He swallowed hard, the memory of bitter taste in his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, his mother's hand tightening on his knee, a silent reassurance. "Officer Hughes," Mr. Henderson's voice, calm and steady, cut through the silence. "Did you witness Officer Daniels' interaction with Jalen Carter on the evening of July 12th? Hughes hesitated, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the jury box. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the room. Jalen could feel his mother's breath hitch beside him. He knew she was holding hers, just as he was, bracing for whatever would come next. Finally, Hughes spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes. And can you describe what you saw?" Another pause, this one even longer than the last. Hughes's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Jalen watched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a strange detachment from the scene, as though he were watching a play unfold, a play in which he was both actor and audience. He went too far. Hughes mumbled, his voice thick with something Jalen couldn't decipher. Shame? Fear? Regret? He wasn't sure. "Officer Hughes," Mr. Henderson pressed, his voice sharpening slightly. "Please be specific. What did you see Officer Daniels do?" Hughes took a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle with anticipation. Jalen could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, heavy on his small frame. He wanted to shrink, to disappear, to escape the suffocating pressure of the moment. But his mother's hand on his knee, a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of his emotions, held him grounded. "He hit the boy," Hughes stammered, his eyes finally meeting Jalen's. There was a flicker of something in their depths, something that resembled remorse. Jalen couldn't be sure. He'd learned to distrust appearances, to look beyond the surface of things. "He hit him more than once," Hughes continued, his voice gaining a little strength, though it still trembled with an undercurrent of fear. Jalen wondered if it was fear of Daniels, of the consequences of speaking the truth, or perhaps fear of something deeper, something within himself. He glanced at Daniels, who remained impassive, his gaze fixed on Hughes, a a silent warning radiating from his rigid posture. Mr. Henderson paused, letting Hughes's words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Jalen could feel his own pulse throbbing in his ears. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the intensity of the moment. "Officer Hughes," Mr. Henderson's voice, calm and controlled, broke the silence. "Did you intervene? Did you attempt to stop Officer Daniels?" Hughes flinched as though struck. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. Jalen watched, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. Pity? Anger? Confusion? He couldn't untangle the threads. "No," Hughes whispered, his voice barely audible. The single word echoed in the hushed courtroom, heavy with the weight of his admission. "Why not?" Mr. Henderson pressed gently. Hughes opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Mr. Henderson's. "I don't know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have. I know I should have." The words, so simple, so stark, hung in the air, vibrating with a power that resonated deep within Jalen. "I should have stopped it." The confession, wrenched from the depths of Hughes's being, echoed the silent scream that had been trapped inside Jalen for so long. He felt a strange sense of release, a loosening of the knot that had been tightening in his chest for months. The rest of the trial unfolded in a blur. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit Jalen's testimony seemed feeble, almost pathetic, in the face of Hughes's confession. Then, the unexpected happened. A grainy video, captured by a nearby security camera, surfaced. The footage, though partially obscured, clearly corroborated Jalen's account. It showed Daniel's brutal attack, Hughes's passive observation, and Jalen's small, trembling form huddled on the ground. The jury's deliberation was short. The verdicts, delivered with a solemnity that underscored the gravity of the situation, echoed through the silent courtroom. Guilty on all counts. As the words reverberated through the room, Jalen felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He leaned against his mother, her arms wrapping around him, a warm, protective embrace. He closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of what had happened, the trauma, the pain, the fear. But beneath it all, a new emotion began to surface, tentative and fragile, but undeniably present. Hope. Justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived. The stale, recycled air of the courtroom held its breath. A pin could have dropped, echoing through the tense silence. Jalen sat beside his mother, his small hand enveloped in hers. Her grip was firm, yet her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. He could feel the rapid pulse throbbing beneath her skin, a frantic drumbeat against his own numb hand. He knew she was terrified, even though her face, a carefully composed mask of quiet strength, betrayed nothing. "Just a little longer, Ma," he thought, the words unuttered, a silent promise resonating between them. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a caged bird desperate for release. The past few days, the relentless questioning, the defense attorney's insidious insinuations, had chipped away at him, leaving him raw and exposed. He had told the truth over and over, each repetition a fresh wound. Yet, a sliver of ice-cold fear still lingered. What if they didn't believe him? What if the powerful won again? The jury filed in, their faces etched with a gravity that mirrored the weight of the room. Each juror avoided his gaze, their eyes flitting away as if unable to bear the burden of his small, fragile hope. He swallowed, the lump in his throat thick and suffocating. His mother squeezed his hand tighter, her silent support a lifeline in the turbulent sea of uncertainty. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, picturing the alleyway, the harsh glare of the streetlight, the searing pain. He forced the image away, focusing on the rhythmic rise and fall of his mother's chest beside him. "Breathe," he reminded himself, "just breathe." The foreman, a woman with weary eyes and lines etched deep into her face, cleared her throat. The sound, amplified in the hushed courtroom, was like a gunshot. Every head turned towards her, every breath held captive. The prosecuting attorney stood, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The defense attorney, his usual polished demeanor slightly ruffled, adjusted his tie, a nervous tic Jalen had observed throughout the trial. The two officers, Daniels and Hughes, stood side by side, Daniels with a rigid, defiant posture, Hughes pale and trembling, his gaze fixed on the floor. Jalen watched Hughes, a flicker of something akin to understanding, perhaps even empathy, stirring within him. He wondered if Hughes regretted what he'd done, if the weight of his actions finally pressed down on him. We find Officer Daniels, the foreman's voice, though clear, trembled slightly, guilty. The word hung in the air, heavy and resonant. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Daniels stiffened, his face contorting with rage. A low murmur began to rise from the gallery. The judge banged his gavel, restoring a semblance of order. Jalen's mother's grip on his hand tightened, her knuckles white. He looked at her, searching her face. Relief, raw and palpable, warred with a lingering disbelief in her eyes. He felt a similar turmoil within himself. The word, guilty, echoed in his mind, a strange, unfamiliar sound. He had imagined this moment so many times, yet the reality of it felt surreal, almost dreamlike. We find Officer Hughes guilty. The foreman's voice, stronger now, delivered the final blow. Hughes swayed, his legs buckling beneath him. Two bailiffs moved to steady him, their hands gripping his arms. He looked up, his eyes meeting Jalen's for the first time. In that fleeting moment of connection, Jalen saw not defiance, but a profound, desolate despair. He saw the shattered remnants of a man consumed by guilt. A strange wave of pity washed over Jalen, a feeling he couldn't quite comprehend. He had hated these men, feared them, but now, seeing Hughes broken, he felt nothing, just an overwhelming emptiness. The courtroom erupted. A cacophony of sounds, gasps, sobs, shouts of jubilation filled the air. The judge's gavel banged repeatedly, a futile attempt to quell the rising tide of emotion. Jalen sat, numb, amidst the chaos, the sounds washing over him like a distant wave. He looked at his mother, her face streaked with tears, a tentative smile gracing her lips. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. The noise slowly subsided, replaced by a hushed murmur. The judge addressed the court, his voice firm and resolute. Jalen barely registered his words, the pronouncements of sentencing fading into the background. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few weeks, the fear, the pain, the relentless fight for justice. He had spoken, and he had been heard. The powerful had been held accountable. It was a victory, not just for him, but for every other child, every other voiceless victim, silenced by fear and intimidation. As they left the courtroom, surrounded by a throng of reporters and well-wishers, Jalen felt his mother's arm around his shoulders, a protective shield against the flashing cameras and the barrage of questions. He leaned into her embrace, drawing strength from her presence. The sunlight, streaming through the courthouse windows, felt warm on his face. He took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom. He knew the road ahead would be long, the healing process slow and arduous. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his mother, his family, and a community that had rallied behind him. He had spoken, and his voice had made a difference. And in that, he found a quiet, profound strength. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. Justice, he realized, was not just a word, but a tangible force, a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. And sometimes, even a small voice, when amplified by courage and truth, could shake the foundations of power,